Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Insight Podcast. So, in the past couple of weeks, obviously in the news, it's been huge. Israel and Iran have entered their most direct military confrontation in decades. Israel launched a major airstrike on Iran's nuclear and military infrastructure, with Iran then retaliating with a wave of missiles, drones targeting Israeli cities. So far, hundreds have been killed, civilian infrastructure is under strain, and the U.S. is considering deeper involvement. So to talk about all this, we've got a full house. We're going to go through them one by one, each person covering their own aspect of this conflict. So first up, Noam Ostfeld, principal analyst for the Middle East, North Africa, and Turkey, is going to take us through Israel's objectives, operational scope, followed then by Megan Sutcliffe, principal analyst for the Middle East and Africa, who is going to cover Iran's perspective, including their situation internally and their capacity for escalation. We'll then move on to Omar Khadr, intelligence analyst on the MENAT desk as well, who's going to cover the regional implications and touch on Iran's proxies and what their status is in all this. And then to close us out, Brady is going to tell us exactly what's going on in Donald Trump's head, give us the U.S.'s military posture, decision-making, strategic calculus as best that she can. So thank you all for joining. Let's start with Noam. Noam, just take us through Israel's main objective and any limits to this objective.
Hi, Sam. Thank you. I think that in terms of the objective that we are seeing from Israel, it's a long-term objective of completely removing the Iranian threat in terms of the nuclear program and the weapon development program. And in that regard, that's why we are seeing a lot of focus of Israel on striking Iranian nuclear facilities and military infrastructure. However, the objective is mainly for a long-term objective, and we have two limits for that. And the first one is that a lot of the nuclear facilities are heavily fortified, and the second is that even completely destroying those facilities, there's a risk here that Iran will continue and rebuild afterwards and retrieve its capabilities. And this is the main limit in that regard of the results might actually be temporary rather than for the longer term or for forever, as Israel would very much like.
Awesome. Thank you, Noam. So the next logical question then, what avenues does Israel have to achieve this objective, and can they realistically do it?
Exactly. So in that regard, if looking on achieving the long-term objective, Israel has two main options. Of course, those two options will go together with a kinetic strike, with the complete destruction of the facilities. But the two additional options for Israel in terms of the long term are mainly revolving around the destabilization of the regime until it collapses. And then the second one, to achieve a draconian nuclear deal with the US, Iran, or international partners that will heavily limit Iran's ability to rebuild its nuclear infrastructure and weapon development facilities. And in regard of how likely is Israel to achieve this, I think that the first objective of the destruction of the facilities with more temporary achievement is the most likely scenario in that regard. And regarding the two other objectives, I think that Israel definitely aim for them. We're definitely working towards them. However, Israel will still continue and assess the situation on the ground, and it's possible that in the end we will see actually Israel pulling back, Israel seeing that those became harder to achieve, harder to reach, and possibly just satisfying themselves with the temporarily or delayed nuclear program for now.
Understood. So, Noam, how effective was Iran's response? And is there any possibility that Israel would de-escalate in face of further responses from Iran?
Yes, so in general, what we are seeing, the Iranian response so now is relatively little. compared to at least what the Israeli military officials were expecting. They were expecting that heavy barrages of Iranian missiles, casualties numbering between 800 to 4,000. Now we are seeing casualties rates in Israel so far less than 30. And we're seeing that the air defenses of Israel are intercepting in a rate of about 92%. However, Iran still didn't use all of its capabilities, all of its missiles. It didn't use its one-ton missiles. It didn't use more accurate missiles. So there's a lot of options for Iran to continue in that regard and cause a lot of disruption in Israel. And this brings us to the de-escalation scenarios for Israel. What might push Israel to de-escalate apart from achieving its goals. First one is actually the U.S. pressure for Israel to stop. We see, and of course, this goes together with Israel's assessment that the facilities are destroyed. So even with U.S. Pressure, still Israel need to destroy the facilities, the nuclear facilities. The other one that we are seeing here is a long-term conflict with accumulating damage for Israel, for infrastructure, for civilians, to the point that, again, Israel is deciding to scale back its attack, decide to take the wins that it has, and basically go home. So those are the main two things, U.S. or international pressure, and then a long-term conflict that Israel decides that it's better to just take what it has.
Yeah, understood. Thank you very much, Noam. Okay, so let's move to Iran. And Megan, what has Israel targeted and how has this impacted Iran so far just in the last couple of weeks?
Hi, Sam. So, in the past 8 days of military operations, we have seen Israel engaging in widespread airstrikes targeting a variety of facilities. In the first few days of Operation Rising Lion, we saw Israel primarily targeting Iran's military positions, so military bases, but also depots for missiles and drones, production facilities, and also significantly missile launch facilities. We also saw Israel engaging in numerous strikes targeting nuclear facilities and infrastructure, most prolifically the Natanz uranium enrichment site. In combination with these strikes, we've also seen Israel engaging in numerous assassinations targeting high-ranking nuclear scientists and high-ranking members of Iran's security forces, not least the head of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, as well as the head of the armed forces. Increasingly, though, over the past few days, since the end of the weekend, we've seen Israel expanding the types of targets that it's willing to engage with. We've seen increasing strikes on dual-use infrastructure, such as airports, as well as locations such as state television broadcast facilities, clips of which were widely shared on social media. We've also seen increasingly in the capital, Tehran, Israel engaging in strikes targeting internal security mechanisms like the Ministry of Intelligence and the Law Enforcement Command. This has given some weight to the assessment that Israel is possibly aiming to critically destabilize Iran's government in order to increase pressure on Iran to make concessions and capitulate, to essentially dismantle its nuclear program in order to ensure its survival. It's worth noting we've also seen limited strikes on energy facilities, though these have been primarily ones geared towards domestic supplies, not necessarily international oil markets. However, Israel retains the capabilities to conduct strikes on Iranian oil export facilities at any point it wishes.
Thanks, Megan. So what's it look like inside Iran? Public mood, economic pressures, internal displacement, maybe?
It is a challenging environment to assess given the lack of press coverage within Iran. However, what we do know is that there has been substantial displacement, with thousands of civilians evacuating cities that are being frequently targeted, particularly Tehran. After evacuation orders were issued by Israel over the past week, we've seen traffic jams on major highways lasting at least 12 hours as people are attempting to move away from locations that have been identified as being dangerous. The increasing pressure on energy infrastructure and on internal security control would also indicate that there is a substantial and increasing risk of anti-government sentiment evolving over time into anti-government protest activity and domestic unrest. When paired with the significant economic pressures that Iran faces, given that it remains under US sanctions and the Iranian rial remains extremely devalued vis-a-vis the US dollar, unfortunately, we are in a situation of extreme domestic precarity within Iran. In terms of how this will evolve in the coming weeks, as we see the security environment continue to develop in response to Israeli strikes, then risks of unrest and protest movements will increase. It's also worth noting that Iran is an incredibly diverse country, and there are numerous secessionist movements that are active in various regions, most prolifically in Sistan and Baluchistan. But there are also substantial populations of ethnic Azeris, ethnic Kurds, but also ethnic Arabs who, at certain points in Iran's history, have engaged in armed insurgency. As we see continued pressure on government stability and security force capacity, risks of remobilization of these movements and increasing unrest in these areas will increase over time.
Understood. So, similar to the question that I put to Noam, what options does Iran have in deterring continued Israeli strikes? Do they have any options?
Unfortunately, Iran is relatively limited when it comes to its conventional abilities to combat or deter Israeli strikes. We have seen Israel essentially eradicating the majority of Iranian air defenses, and the Israeli Air Force effectively operates with impunity in Iranian airspace. We've also seen Israel engaging in numerous strikes targeting missile depots and production facilities, as well as launch facilities, and this limits Iran's capabilities to launch numerous barrages of missiles towards Israel over time. In essence, this means that Iran likely has two primary options for attempting to deter strikes continuing from Israel. The first is, of course, engagement in negotiations with the United States. We know from reports yesterday, for example, that came out on the 19th of June, that the US had engaged with Iran, likely in Oman, to discuss a possible de-escalation. But Iran conditioned further engagement on Israel ceasing its military operations immediately. So it's relatively challenging to see exactly how that dynamic will proceed when there are no signs of Israel letting up for the moment. Other options that Iran has is, of course, the Strait of Hormuz, which is one of the world's trade arteries when it comes to oil and gas. Iran has the capability to restrict the movement of vessels through this critical waterway, and in an extreme situation, there is a realistic possibility that Iran would in some way attempt to restrict this movement in order to impact global markets, undermine US support for Israel, and therefore deter further Israeli strikes.
Thank you, Megan. Yeah, so the Strait of Hormuz, Omar, we saw a lot this past year of a lot of in the news about Iranian proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis. What's their status in the midst of all this?
So far we did not see heavy involvement in the current war by Iran proxies, with, of course, the exception of the Yemen-based Houthis. But the Israeli and Houthi mutual hostilities been already going on since the onset of Gaza war in 2023 and have its own dynamic. So yeah, basically the Houthis sporadic strikes against Israel by ballistic missiles or drones through the Red Sea will likely continue in the coming weeks and months, and they are not necessarily tied to the developments and what's happening right now between Iran and Israel. However, this dynamic will likely get worse, a lot worse, in the event of U.S. strikes on Iran if U.S. eventually decided to join the war. Of course, in this case, the de facto truce between the Houthis and the U.S. forces will likely be collapsed, and the Houthis will likely resume attacks against U.S. vessels in the Red Sea and also resume attacks on commercial vessels linked to Israeli ports. But when it comes to the main threat right now, which are the Iranian proxies in Iraq, yes, I mean, although we did not see attacks against Israel so far, by these groups. But however, this dynamic will also possibly change if the current war prolonged and extended through the next 2 weeks to a month from now. Also, these risks will significantly increase, of course, if the US intervened. So it's basically the most prominent Iraqi proxies right now are the Shia groups like Kataib Hezbollah and other factions under a bigger umbrella group called the Islamic Resistance in Iraq, IRI. These groups already warned of this scenario and warned that they will attack U.S. assets across the region if the U.S. decided to enter the war in support of Israel. These groups mainly have drones and short-range missiles, but mainly drones, which was used before to target Israeli infrastructures, ports. Although like 99% of these ordnance and drones were already intercepted by the Israeli air defense systems. But of course, the falling sharpness on residential areas will remain a threat in this scenario too. Concerning Hezbollah, the crown rule of Iran's proxies in the region, in our current assessment, the group is unlikely to be involved in this current war between Israel and Iran, as its military capabilities remains heavily degraded following the war with Israel. Also, the group's main focus right now is rebuilding this arsenal inside Lebanon, and also rebuilding its political base and its funding networks and local facilities all over the country. So yeah, Hezbollah basically has got much bigger problems to deal right now. Concerning Hamas in Gaza, technically, we do not classify Hamas as Iranian proxy, but rather an ally. However, the group also remains heavily degraded, much degraded than Hezbollah, of course, inside Gaza. And the Gaza war itself became a separate conflict with its own dynamics and triggers, and not necessarily tied to what will happen with Israel and Iran. However, there is a possibility that Israel will likely capitalize on the current global shift of attention towards Iran, away from Gaza right now, to pose more military pressure on Hamas and use this momentum in military operations to be used as leveraged in any prospective hostage talks in the coming weeks.
Thanks, Omar. So, as you said, the biggest threat right now is the Shia groups in Iraq. So you mentioned targeting Western presence there. I know the report from your desk mentioned potentially targeting Western businesses, embassies. How big of an issue is this likely to be? Will this expand to the broader region, not just Iraq?
In Iraq, we should notice that Shia groups are not united in their stance regarding the current war between Iran and Israel. While they obviously, all of them, condemn the Israeli strikes and any possible U.S. intervention, there is currently a rift between the pro-Iran proxies like the Popular Mobilization Forces or the IRI, or even some rogue Shia groups, and the prominent Shia cleric called Muqtada al-Sadr, who is basically the head of the Sadrist movement. Al-Sadr basically opposes getting involved by any means in this war, getting Iraq involved in this war. Although he typically condemned the Israeli strikes against Iran, but here we have this Shia rift within Iraq that will likely manifest in the coming days, as already most of these Shia groups, including the Sadrists, had called for protests against Israel and against the US in Baghdad. And these protests, they are most likely to be peaceful. However, there is a possibility that some pro-Iranian Shia groups will use these protests in order to attack some Western businesses tied to the US or even the US embassy inside Iraq. And of course, in any potential involvement of these Iraqi proxies against Israel, or even against the U.S. assets, this will make them vulnerable to U.S. and Israeli retaliation and strikes inside Iraq itself, which will increase domestic instability and further political rifts between the Shia groups. But concerning the second part of your question, whether these threats will be applicable to other parts of the region, we do not see that if the U.S. intervened in the Iranian war, we do not see that there will be much protest against the U.S. In most Middle Eastern countries. However, Iraq will be the main threat, and in some sort, we can also expect anti-U.S. protests in Lebanon, but these will be likely limited, not as big as Iraq, of course.
Thank you, Omar. So if the U.S. is to join, keep an eye on Iraq. So speaking of the U.S., Claire, maybe he will, maybe he won't. I've really only got two kind of big questions for you. The first one, it's kind of a two-parter. First, just what is your read as best that you can on Trump's plans? And the second half there, are there any signals, anything we can glean from U.S. troop movements in the region?
Yeah, absolutely. Trump has admittedly said he hasn't decided what he's going to do. But right now we put it at a realistic possibility that the U.S. does get directly involved in the next 2 weeks. Just yesterday, we saw that Trump announced that he could take up to 2 weeks to decide whether to strike Iran, with the intention of giving the diplomatic route another shot and kind of providing an off-ramp for these escalations. And now, before that, we had the latest reports indicating also that Trump told senior aides that he did approve attack plans for Iran, but was holding off on giving the final order to see if Tehran would ultimately abandon its nuclear program. This 2-week window gives additional time for the U.S. military in the region to continue to bolster its presence, specifically for a second aircraft carrier to get into place, which would put the military in a much more advantageous place to counter inevitable Iranian retaliation, as everyone just described previously. But this also puts Trump a bit more back into the driver's seat. Previously, it seemed that Netanyahu was kind of making more of the demands, and he was kind of dictating the timeline of this war, and really putting the pressure on the U.S. to join in. But now, with Trump saying this, he is effectively, taking back control of the timeline that the U.S. will be operating on. And while, of course, we can't put too much stock into, Trump and deadlines and timelines, we've seen time and time again him ignore his stated dates for things. It does still, though, underscore that he is ultimately undecided, and likely leaning towards really wanting to stay out of the conflict, which is why, he put this 2-week time period out there, to turn down the dial a little bit, and kind of, as I said, take that control. Now, a little bit more on the troop movement in the region. As you said, the U.S. is ultimately bolstering up in the Middle East. As I said, we have the second aircraft carrier getting into position. Now, this carrier was already scheduled to come into the area in the longer term, but this was expedited due to these developments. And of course, the U.S. doesn't need 2 carrier strike groups in the region just for routine ops. This does mean, it is getting ready for the potential to do something. We've also seen F-16s, F-22s, and F-35s being rerouted to the Middle East following this carrier, to show that the U.S. really is ready to strike at any time. And also notable, of course, before Israel originally struck Iran, we did see the U.S. Evacuate non-essential personnel and military families from its bases in Iraq, Bahrain, and Kuwait, to protect against what Omar was just describing, that potential retaliation in the broader region. So all of that is to say that while Trump is really, again, pushing for negotiations and a diplomatic route out, the U.S. military is ready and capable at any moment to strike.
So on the nuclear negotiation front, what's going on there?
Yeah, so we also saw very recent reports that Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and the Iranian foreign minister have spoken by phone several times since Israel began striking last week in a bid to find this diplomatic end. But as Megan earlier stated, Tehran has said that it's not going to return to negotiations until Israel stops. This was a pretty notable development, especially as Witkoff was told that Tehran could show flexibility in the nuclear issue if DC started to turn the screw on Israel. However, it is very likely that Trump, would only agree to any type of ceasefire that is contingent on a much wider nuclear-related deal at the same time. At the start of these nuclear talks, there was the proposal of a 3.6% enrichment plan that could have been on the table. Now it looks like that Trump will only accept 0% enrichment on Iranian soil, with potential openness to an Iranian civil nuclear program held outside of its borders. So that is where the U.S. is coming from and what its requirements would be. But it's still, unlikely, if not clear, what Iran really is ready to credibly offer, if anything. And if, again, as everyone said before, if Israel is also ready to go down that line.
Thank you, Claire. And thank you to everyone, Claire, Megan, Noam, and Omar. Their desks have been working very hard, contributing to our regular WRR offering and reporting, but in particular, with relevance to this topic, the recent MECU, the Middle East Crisis Update, which has a particular focus on this conflict. So anyone listening, we are offering WRR trials, and you can get in touch with us, info@sibylline.co.uk, if you would like to receive a copy of that. Enjoy your weekend, keep an eye on this, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you, Sam.